Marvin Gaye here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Events are being held across the country and the globe today to mark World Refugee Day. According to the United Nations, by the end of 2007, there were more than 11 million refugees worldwide and 26 million internally displaced people. It was the second year in a row the number had gone up after 5 years of falling. Well, we're going to talk about refugees today. Refugees called immigrants in this country, dying to live, a story of U.S. immigration, an age of global apartheid, is the name of a new book by Professor Joseph Nevins. He's a geographer. He's a professor at Vassar College. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Thank you, Amy. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, your book is about Mexicans coming over the border. It's a specific story and then goes much broader than that. But how would you fit this story into the idea of refugees?
Well, refugees under international law is actually a very narrow concept. It's a concept defined by the 1951 Refugee Convention. And according to that convention, a refugee is a person who finds him or herself outside of his or her country due to what they call a well-founded fear of persecution. Persecution on the basis of their membership in a particular ethno-racial, religious or national or social group, or because of their particular political persuasion or political opinion. As such, they're under threat in their country of origin, where they're born, or their country of habitual residence, and they feel compelled to avail themselves of the protection of a national government elsewhere. As you said, there are about, according to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, about 37 million refugees. Right? This does not include people who are not recognized, even though they have a well-founded fear of persecution. It does not include what are called economic migrants. They're not referred to as refugees. It doesn't include, as we talked about in the previous segment with David Halvag, about climate or ecological and environmental refugees. So there are huge numbers of people who have driven out of their homelands by factors that are beyond their control that aren't included under the protections of the international refugee regime. Just to take one example, we know that at least a few million Iraqis have been driven out of their country because of the disastrous U.S. invasion and ongoing occupation. Yet the vast majority of these people find themselves in some sort of political legal limbo in places like Syria and Iran, in large part because countries like the United States aren't willing to accord international refugee status. So while the United States is largely responsible for this refugee disaster emanating from Iraq, the United States, last time I checked, had only accepted a little under 5,000 of these people to allow them to come to the United States to migrate legally. And we're going to hear from one of them in a few minutes. But I wanted to ask first your use of language. You qualify what you write at the beginning of your book. Mm-hmm. Well, one of the terms that we often hear is this term illegal, right? Illegal alien or something like that. And this is a term that has been created by national governments as a way of criminalizing what I see, and many members of the international human rights community and migrant rights community see, as a basic human right, the right to migrate. If we take international human rights conventions seriously, and these conventions include rights such as the right to have an adequate diet, the right to have a job with sufficient pay, the right to provide for one's basic necessities. In many countries in the world, because of a socio-political situation, there aren't sufficient resources. There isn't sufficient stability for people to realize those rights. Right? In order to access the resources necessary to realize those rights, they need to migrate. If you deny them the right to migrate, you're effectively denying them the right to have those rights. Right? So in that sense, international human rights becomes meaningless if we don't have a right to migrate. So you chose the word? Well, I use terms like, I mean, there is no perfect word, but I use words like unauthorized, undocumented, or unsanctioned. So I'm not sort of privileging the discourse of the state, which criminalizes migrants they don't recognize. Tell us the story of Julio Cesar Gallegos. The book focuses on the life and death of Julio Cesar Gallegos, who died in the Imperial Valley Desert of California in August 1998. He was 23 years old. He was returning from his hometown of Juchipila, Zacatecas, which is in central Mexico. He was returning from Juchipila to East Los Angeles, where his wife, Jacqueline Murillo, a U.S. citizen, Chicana, and his son were living at the time. Julio Cesar had been living and working in East Los Angeles since 1993. When he first tried to cross the U.S.-Mexico border in 1993, it was fairly and relatively easy to cross without authorization. But beginning in the mid-1990s, under the Clinton administration, we saw a massive buildup in immigration and boundary enforcement. As a result, when he tried to return in 1998, after having to return to Uchipila to attend to some family emergencies, things had radically shifted. There'd been a deep intensification of boundary enforcement. As a result, he had to travel through very arduous terrain, and ultimately caused his death. He and 6 others were found under a salt cedar tree in the desert in August 1998. Their bodies were literally black because they had putrefied or mummified as a result of the intense desert heat. His death received a lot of attention in the press in California, in part because it was the largest group of bodies that had ever been found in California history, and also because his wife was a U.S. citizen, so it was somewhat unique in terms of the migrant deaths. That said, his story is just one story of a much larger death toll. Since the mid-1990s, it is estimated that well over 5,000 migrant corpses have been recovered in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. And the reason I use the word recovered is because there is certainly a much larger death toll, that we don't know exactly how many people have died because the vastness of the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, the density of a lot of the vegetation, the remoteness of a lot of the areas, and the fact that, especially in the summer, bodies can break down, according to medical anthropologists, in about 11 days. Right? You know, internal organs, skin can be completely eradicated. All that remains is the skeletal remains, and they're often scattered by animals.
The way you begin your story, it was a little after 9 a.m. on August 13th, 1998, when Ralph Smith, the deputy coroner for California's Imperial County, received the phone call. About 2 hours earlier, a ranch foreman passing through a U.S. Border Patrol checkpoint on State Route 86 had informed agents there was a group of people in trouble in the desert about 6 miles south of nearby State Route 78. Take it from there. Right.
And when they got there, they found these 7 bodies, and this led to a lot of coverage. Again,
they looked charred.
The bodies looked charred, right? They were. I've seen pictures of the body that the coroner has provided. And when I say some parts of the body were literally black, right, because of the process of mummification or putrefaction, right? In the case of Julio Cesar Gallegos, his eyes were missing, for example, right, as a result of this process.
He was found holding the son.
He was holding the picture of his 2-year-old son, Julio Jr. Some of his clothes were missing. Often what happens is migrants, as they're going through the process of hyperthermia, right, with excessive body heat, they lose the control of their faculties, and they will often strip their clothes off. So frequently migrants are found naked or partially naked. There was no signs of malfeasance or anything like that. It was probably he or the other migrants that did that.
And so now fit this into this bigger picture and where you think policy needs to be today.
Right. Well, one of the goals of these various operations that the U.S. government began instituting in the mid-1990s, operations such as Operation Gatekeeper in Southern California, Operation Safeguard in Southern Arizona, Operation Rio Grande in Southern Texas, Operation Hold the Line in El Paso. The goal of these operations was to push migrants out of what they call the urban corridors into more remote, arduous terrain. And the thinking behind this was that once faced with this more arduous remote terrain and a far more difficult journey, most migrants would make a rational cost-benefit analysis and give up. Well, that's not what's happened. While maybe a few people have done this, the vast majority have just decided to take the risk because the forces compelling them to migrate are so great. As a result of this, while we've long seen migrant deaths, going back to the 1800s when Chinese migrants were trying to get around the Chinese exclusion laws, the number of deaths and how people are dying, the number of deaths has skyrocketed, and how people are dying has radically changed. We're seeing people die much more due to environmental factors, excessive heat, most importantly, but in the winter, excessive cold. And again, as a result, the number of deaths has reached at least 5,000 over the last 12, 13 years. Right? Now, in terms of policy, in many ways, I think the system is fundamentally broken because the problem is that in the political class, the dominant ways of seeing migrants and unauthorized immigration in the United States is to see it within a framework of law and order, in terms of national security, not in terms of human rights, nor in terms of the complex political and economic factors that are driving immigration. NAFTA, for example, the North American Free Trade Agreement, has played a significant role in helping to drive migration from Mexico as it disturbs, as it destabilizes the agricultural economy and the rural sectors of the country.
How does it do that?
Well, NAFTA was sold to the U.S. public in a variety of ways. And one of the principal ways that the Clinton administration and its supporters tried to sell it was by employing sort of standard neoclassical economic theory. And what they said is that the rising tide of NAFTA will lift all boats. In other words, NAFTA will bring increased prosperity for people in Canada, the United States, and most importantly in terms of immigration, Mexico. As a result of that, the pressures for people to leave, to migrate elsewhere, will be greatly reduced. That's what they were saying publicly. Privately, or in less public spheres, they were saying something very different. Doris Meissner, who was the head of what was then the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service,